On the night of May 12th, 1973, Robert Garwood sits alone in a bamboo cage somewhere in the mountains of Quang Nam Province, Vietnam. The war is over. Nixon announced it 2 months ago. The television back home showed the prisoners coming off those planes at Clark Air Base in the Philippines. Skeletal men in ill-fitting clothes, blinking in the sunlight, crying as they touched American soil. But Garwood is still here. He presses his face against the bamboo slats, watching his guards play cards by lamplight. They're laughing, relaxed. They haven't mentioned his release, haven't even hinted at it. Through the thick jungle canopy above, he can barely see the stars, the same stars shining over a country that thinks he's already home. Or dead. Or something worse. In a basement office at the Pentagon, 7,000 miles away, a file with Garwood's name sits in a locked cabinet. The classification stamp reads, "Is secret/no fawn." Inside are intercepts, radio chatter, intelligence reports suggesting men are still being held. The file is 3 inches thick. No one will look at it for 6 more years. How many men were left behind? How many families were lied to? And why did the United States government spend 50 years burying the evidence? February 12th, 1973, Hanoi, North Vietnam. The first group of American prisoners of war walks across the tarmac at Gia Lam Airport toward a waiting C-141 Starlifter. They're gaunt, some limping, others helped by medics. Flashbulbs pop, cameras roll. This is Operation Homecoming, the moment America has been waiting for. Captain Jeremiah Denton emerges from the plane at Clark Air Base in the Philippines and delivers the line that will be played on every news broadcast for the next week. "We are honored to have had the opportunity to serve our country under difficult circumstances." Over the next 2 months, 591 American prisoners return home. The Pentagon declares it a complete success. Defense Secretary Elliot Richardson stands at a podium and announces that all American POWs held in Southeast Asia have been accounted for and repatriated. But in the back of the room, a junior Defense Intelligence Agency analyst named Jerry Mooney sits with a folder in his lap. Inside are the names of 324 men, pilots, soldiers, Marines, who were confirmed captured alive but didn't come home. Men whose shoot-downs were witnessed. Men who sent letters from captivity that suddenly stopped. Men whose names appeared on enemy prisoner lists but were never released. Mooney doesn't say anything. He's been told not to, because admitting that men were left behind would mean admitting that the Paris Peace Accords, the treaty that ended America's involvement in Vietnam, was a failure. It would mean political catastrophe. It would mean that Henry Kissinger's Nobel Peace Prize was built on a lie. So the files get classified. The families get told their sons and husbands died in the jungle. And the men still in those cages? They become ghosts. But Vietnam wasn't the first time this happened. Not even close. July 27th, 1953. Panmunjom, Korea. The armistice is signed. The Korean War is over. Over the next few weeks, Operation Big Switch brings home 3,746 American prisoners of war. The Red Cross certifies the exchange. The government declares all prisoners accounted for. Except they weren't. In the months after the war, something strange starts happening. American soldiers stationed in Japan begin reporting sightings of Caucasian prisoners in Soviet labor camps along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Train conductors, maintenance workers, engineers, men in threadbare uniforms speaking English. When these reports reach Army intelligence, they're filed away and marked unsubstantiated. Then, in 1954, a Soviet defector named Yuri Rastvorov walks into the CIA station in Tokyo. He's a lieutenant colonel in the KGB, and he has a story to tell. During the war, he says, thousands of American and British prisoners were secretly transferred from North Korea to the Soviet Union. Not just enlisted men, pilots, intelligence officers, technical specialists, men whose knowledge would be valuable. The CIA debriefs him for 3 months. They polygraph him. His story checks out. The report goes up the chain to Director Alan Dulles. And then, nothing. The intelligence is classified top secret eyes only and buried. The families are never told. Why? Because acknowledging that the Soviets kidnapped American POWs would shatter the fragile post-war peace. Eisenhower is negotiating arms control. The Cold War is just beginning. Admitting this would mean confronting the Soviet Union, possibly even war. So the prisoners stay in the camps, building roads, mining coal, freezing in Siberia. Forgotten by the time the Senate Select Committee on POW-MIA Affairs investigates in 1992. 39 years later, they'll find evidence of over 900 Korean War prisoners who were never repatriated. Men with names, service numbers, families who died never knowing the truth. You'd think it couldn't go back further, but it does. April 29th, 1945. A farm outside Moosburg, Germany. The 14th Armored Division of the US Third Army liberates Stalag 7A, one of the largest POW camps in Nazi Germany. They find 110,000 prisoners, American, British, French, Russian. The emaciated men cheer as Sherman tanks roll through the gates. They're free. The war in Europe is almost over. But as army clerks begin processing the prisoners, they notice something. The numbers don't match. According to Red Cross records, there should be 3,200 American airmen at this camp, bomber crews shot down over Germany. They only find 2,847. Where are the other 353 men? The answer comes in bits and pieces over the next few years. Starting in 1947, former German officers in Allied custody start talking. They describe a secret program called Action Kugel, Operation Bullet. Under this program, certain Allied prisoners, usually airmen, commandos, or intelligence personnel, were quietly transferred out of POW camps and handed over to the Gestapo. Some were executed, others were sent east, to the Soviet-occupied zone. After the war, Stalin was desperate for technical expertise. His country was devastated. He needed engineers, scientists, pilots who understood the new jet technology and radar systems the Luftwaffe had developed. So the Soviets made a deal with certain German commanders. Hand over prisoners with specialized knowledge and we'll be lenient with war crimes tribunals. Hundreds of American and British prisoners were loaded onto trains and sent to the Soviet Union. Most ended up in the Gulag system, the vast network of forced labor camps stretching across Siberia. They were given new identities, told their governments had abandoned them, put to work building factories, railroads, and Soviet infrastructure. In 1955, a former British POW named John Noble returns home after 10 years in Soviet captivity. He testifies before Congress that he personally saw American prisoners in the camps. He provides names, dates, locations. The State Department thanks him for his testimony and does nothing. The files get stamped classified. The families get form letters saying their sons died in service of their country. And the men in the camps? They disappear into the Soviet system. By the time the Cold War ends, they're all dead. Fast forward to 1985. Moscow. A retired Soviet colonel named Dmitry Volkogonov is working in the Central Committee archives when he stumbles across something unexpected. Detailed records of American POWs held in Soviet camps during and after World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Hundreds of files, thousands of pages, photographs, interrogation transcripts. Volkogonov is disturbed. He's a true believer in Soviet ideology, but this is different. These are prisoners of war, a clear violation of the Geneva Conventions. He makes copies of some of the files and locks them away. 7 years later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Volkogonov becomes the head of the new Russian government's military archives. When the US Senate Select Committee on POWMIA Affairs begins its investigation, they ask Russia to open their files. Volkogonov cooperates. Sort of. He turns over 140,000 pages of documents, prisoner lists, transfer orders, interrogation reports. The evidence is undeniable. The Soviet Union systematically detained American POWs from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Some for intelligence exploitation. Others simply because they were useful labor. But here's where it gets dark. When the Senate committee asks the Pentagon to cross-reference these names with their own records, they discover something disturbing. Many of these prisoners, men the Soviets documented holding in the 1950s and 1960s, are listed in US files as killed in action or died in captivity. The Pentagon had known. For decades, they'd had intelligence suggesting these men were alive. But they'd officially declared them dead anyway. Why? Because acknowledging they were alive would mean admitting the US government had abandoned them. It would mean lawsuits, congressional hearings, political disaster. So, the dead stayed dead. On paper, at least. Not everyone was willing to stay quiet. In 1981, a former Defense Intelligence Agency analyst named Bill Hendon gets elected to Congress from North Carolina. He's a former Air Force officer, Vietnam veteran, and he spent years studying the POW issue. Hendon believes there are still American prisoners alive in Southeast Asia. He starts pushing for hearings, demanding the Pentagon declassify files. He partners with Congressman John LaBoutillier from New York, and together they form the POW/MIA task force in Congress. They're treated like conspiracy theorists, cranks. Their colleagues avoid them in the halls, but then the evidence starts coming in. In 1982, a Vietnamese refugee walks into an American embassy in Thailand. He has photographs, grainy, barely visible images of Caucasian men in what looks like a prison camp. The men are thin, bearded, wearing crude prison garb. One of them is holding up his fingers in a specific pattern, a number code prisoners use to identify themselves. The DIA analyzes the photos. They can't conclusively authenticate them, but they can't disprove them either. The images are filed away. Then, in 1985, a former Laotian prison guard defects. He brings with him a list of names, American prisoners he claims were still being held in camps in Laos in the early 1980s. Pilots, Green Berets, CIA operatives. He describes their living conditions. What they ate, what they looked like. The DIA debriefs him for weeks. They verify parts of his story through satellite imagery and signals intelligence. The camps he describes exist. They're in the exact locations he specified. But when Hendon and LaBoutillier demand action, rescue operations, diplomatic pressure, anything, they're told the intelligence isn't solid enough. The files get classified. Again, Hendon doesn't give up. In 1986, he's defeated for re-election, largely due to pressure from Pentagon officials who quietly support his opponent. But before he leaves office, he releases a 500-page report documenting what he's found. It's explosive, damning, and almost completely ignored by the mainstream media. The government's position never changes. All recoverable prisoners of war were brought home. Any intelligence suggesting otherwise is unreliable. The families should accept that their loved ones are dead and move on. But some families won't move on. Anne Griffiths stands at a podium in the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. It's January 1987. Behind her is a blown-up photograph of her husband, Commander Danny Griffiths, in his Navy flight suit. He was shot down over North Vietnam in 1967. "My husband's wingman saw him eject," Anne says. Her voice is steady, but her hands tremble. "He saw the parachute deploy. He saw him land. The North Vietnamese broadcast his name on Radio Hanoi as a captured prisoner. We received letters from him for 2 years. And then, in 1969, the letters stopped. The Pentagon told Anne her husband died in captivity. Natural causes. They couldn't recover his remains. She should accept the death certificate and the benefits and try to move on with her life. But Anne Griffiths is a fighter. She starts filing Freedom of Information Act requests. She hires private investigators. She travels to Southeast Asia and interviews refugees. And, slowly, piece by piece, she assembles evidence that her husband might still be alive. She's not alone. Hundreds of POWMIA families are doing the same thing. They form the National League of POWMIA families. They lobby Congress. They hold vigils. They fly the black POW/MIA flag at their homes, a constant reminder that some men never came home. The Pentagon hates them. In internal memos that will later be declassified, Defense Department officials refer to the families as difficult, emotional, and obstacles to normalizing relations with Vietnam. In one particularly callous memo from 1987, a senior DoD official writes, "These families need to accept reality. Their husbands and sons are dead. Continuing to push this issue only damages US interests. But the families keep pushing. And in 1991, they finally get what they've been demanding, a full Senate investigation. August 1st, 1991. The Senate votes 98-0 to establish the Select Committee on POWMIA Affairs. It's an election year. Desert Storm just ended in triumph. Politicians want to look patriotic. Nobody thinks this investigation will actually find anything. They're wrong. Senator John Kerry, a Vietnam veteran and decorated war hero, is chosen to chair the committee. Senator Bob Smith from New Hampshire, a conservative Republican and fierce POWMIA advocate, then is vice chairman. It's a bipartisan powerhouse. They have subpoena authority. They can compel testimony, access classified files. The committee gets a budget of $2 million and a mandate to find the truth. For the next 15 months, they hold dozens of hearings. They interview hundreds of witnesses. They travel to Hanoi, Moscow, and Vientiane. They dig through classified archives. And what they find is stunning. The evidence suggests hundreds of American POWs were, in fact, left behind after every major American conflict of the 20th century. Not just a few isolated cases, systematic patterns, prisoners transferred to Soviet custody. Men held for years after wars ended. Intelligence reports ignored or suppressed. Families deceived. But here's where the committee faces a choice. They can expose the full truth, and in doing so, destroy the reputations of multiple presidential administrations, shatter public trust in the military, and potentially damage diplomatic relations with Russia and Vietnam. Or they can acknowledge some wrongdoing while maintaining the official position that all recoverable prisoners were brought home. In January 1993, the committee releases its final report. It's 1,223 pages long. It acknowledges that American prisoners of war were held by the Soviet Union. It confirms that intelligence reports were mishandled. It admits that some families were given inaccurate information. But the conclusion is carefully worded. While the committee has some evidence suggesting the possibility a POW may have survived to the present, and while some information remains yet to be investigated, there is, at this time, no compelling evidence that proves that any American remains alive in captivity in Southeast Asia. The key words are compelling evidence and proves. The standard of proof is set so high that nothing short of a living prisoner walking into an embassy would meet it. And conveniently, that's exactly what has never happened. Senator Bob Smith refuses to sign the report. He calls it a whitewash, but he's outvoted. The report is adopted. The committee disbands. And once again, the files are locked away. Remember Robert Garwood, the Marine we met at the beginning, sitting in that cage in 1973. His story is perhaps the most disturbing of all. On March 22nd, 1979, 6 years after Operation Homecoming, an American walks into the US Embassy in Bangkok, Thailand. He's thin, weathered, speaks with a strange accent. He says his name is Robert Garwood. He says he's been a prisoner in Vietnam for 14 years. The embassy staff doesn't believe him at first. They think he's a con artist, a fraud. But they check the records, and Robert Russell Garwood was indeed a Marine private who disappeared near Da Nang in 1965. Listed as missing in action. Presumed dead, Garwood is flown to Hawaii for debriefing. The story he tells is horrific. He was captured in 1965 and spent 14 years in various camps and prisons in Vietnam. He says he tried to escape multiple times. He says the Vietnamese used him as a propaganda tool, forcing him to translate and assist with interrogations. And he says, this is the part that makes Pentagon officials panic. That when he left in 1979, there were still other Americans in captivity. He names names, provides descriptions, describes camp locations. The Pentagon's response is swift and brutal. Instead of treating Garwood as a returned POW, they court-martial him. They charge him with desertion and collaboration with the enemy. They claim he voluntarily stayed with the Vietnamese, that he worked for them willingly, that he's a traitor. The trial is a circus. Garwood is convicted of collaborating with the enemy, the only Vietnam POW to be convicted of such charges. He's dishonorably discharged. He gets no back pay, no benefits, no apology. But here's the thing. Many POMIA advocates believe Garwood was prosecuted not because he collaborated, but because he talked. Because he insisted other men were still being held. Because he was living proof that Operation Homecoming was a lie. If Garwood was telling the truth, if he really was held until 1979, then what he's saying about other prisoners becomes much harder to dismiss. The Pentagon couldn't allow that. so they destroyed his credibility instead. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, investigative journalists and researchers repeatedly try to access POW MIA files under the Freedom of Information Act. They're met with a wall of bureaucratic resistance. Documents are lost. Files are destroyed in a routine records purge. Entire archives are reclassified for national security reasons. When documents are released, they're so heavily redacted they're useless, page after page of black marker covering everything meaningful. In 1993, journalist Sidney Schanberg, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on Cambodia, publishes a lengthy investigation in Penthouse magazine called The Sealed File. He documents how successive presidential administrations have actively suppressed POW/MIA information. He provides specific examples of intelligence reports that were ignored, witnesses who were discredited, and investigations that were shut down. The mainstream media barely covers it. The Washington Post runs a brief dismissive article. The New York Times ignores it entirely. Schanberg's reputation takes a hit. He's labelled a conspiracy theorist. But then something unexpected happens. In 1996, a Senate staffer named Tracy Usry gains access to previously classified records at the Library of Congress. She's doing research for Senator Bob Smith, who's still pushing the POW issue. What she finds is a collection of documents that were never supposed to be made public. Intercepts, intelligence summaries, and internal Pentagon memos from the 1970s and 1980s. The documents are damning. They show that senior defense officials knew intelligence reports about living POWs were credible but chose to dismiss them. They reveal that specific rescue operations were proposed but rejected for political reasons. They prove that families were lied to. Usry compiles everything into a report. She presents it to Senator Smith. He tries to hold hearings. The Pentagon issues a statement saying the documents are taken out of context and misinterpreted by unqualified personnel. The hearings are blocked. The report is buried. And Tracy Usry, she loses her job. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 opens a brief window of opportunity. For a few years, before Putin consolidates power and security services reassert control, the Russian government is relatively transparent. Archives are opened. Historians are allowed access. Former KGB officers speak to Western journalists, and the evidence that emerges is staggering. In 1992, Russian historian Dmitry Volkogonov, who we met earlier, provides the Senate Select Committee with copies of documents showing American POWs were held in Soviet camps. But that's just the beginning. Over the next decade, researchers uncover more. A 1953 Soviet internal memo discussing the American prisoner issue and how to gradually eliminate the problem through natural attrition, a euphemism for letting them die, transfer orders showing American POWs being moved from North Korean camps to Siberian labor camps. Interrogation reports of American airmen providing information about new jet technology and bombing tactics. Photographs of Caucasian prisoners in Soviet camps, their faces worn and hopeless. But there's a problem. The Russian government will only provide copies of documents. They won't allow American officials to enter the archives and conduct a comprehensive search. They won't provide a complete accounting of American prisoners. They give just enough evidence to be tantalizing, but not enough to be conclusive. Why? Leverage. The Russian Federation is a new country, economically desperate, seeking Western aid and investment. The POW issue is a bargaining chip. Give us what we want, and we'll give you more information. Push too hard, and the archives close. By the late 1990s, as Russia becomes more authoritarian, the window slams shut. Archives are reclassified. Access is restricted. Former KGB officers who spoke too openly suddenly become unavailable. The trail goes cold. American officials express disappointment, but do nothing. The political will to push harder doesn't exist. Relations with Russia are already tense over NATO expansion and other issues. The POW MIA families are told the Russian government is cooperating to the fullest extent possible. It's a lie, but it's a convenient one. Southeast Asia presents a different kind of problem. Unlike Russia, Vietnam wants normalized relations with the United States. They want trade, investment, military cooperation. But they too have something to hide. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the Vietnamese government allows limited American access to wartime records. They conduct joint field investigations with US teams looking for crash sites and remains. They return boxes of bones and artifacts. It's all very cooperative and friendly. But they're also very selective about what they allow investigators to see. American teams are never allowed unsupervised access to military archives. They're never permitted to interview former camp guards or prison officials without government minders present. Certain areas of the country, particularly border regions with Laos and Cambodia, are off limits for security reasons. And periodically, just often enough to keep American interest alive, a new piece of evidence emerges. A villager remembers seeing an American prisoner. A farmer plows up dog tags. A partial skeleton is found. These discoveries are trumpeted by the Pentagon as evidence of progress. They're used to justify continued cooperation with Vietnam, but they never answer the fundamental question. Were men knowingly left behind? And are any still alive? In 2008, a former Vietnamese military officer named Bui Tin defects to France. In interviews with Western journalists, he makes explosive claims. He says that after Operation Homecoming in 1973, dozens of American prisoners were kept in secret camps in remote areas. Some were held for intelligence purposes. Others were kept as potential bargaining chips for reparations the US had promised, but never paid. He says most died in captivity within a few years. Disease, malnutrition, despair. But he insists some were alive into the 1980s, maybe longer. He can't provide proof. He didn't personally see these men, but he heard about them from other officers. It was an open secret in certain military circles. The Pentagon dismisses his claims as unreliable hearsay. Bui Tin is elderly, they say. His memory is faulty. He's seeking attention. The usual playbook. But private investigators track down two other former Vietnamese military officials who corroborate parts of his story. They too speak of secret camps, prisoners kept after the war. A deliberate deception. Nothing comes of it. The US government has too much invested in the normalization of relations with Vietnam. Opening this can of worms would derail years of diplomatic progress. So, the claims are noted, filed, and forgotten. The most recent and perhaps most credible evidence comes from an unlikely source, a humanitarian aid worker named Maria Chen. In 2012, Chen is working for an international NGO in rural Laos, near the Vietnamese border. She's distributing medical supplies to remote villages. One evening, she's invited to have dinner with a village elder. They're eating when she notices an old man sitting in the corner. He's different from the others. Lighter skin, different bone structure. She assumes he's French, a remnant from the colonial era. But when she makes eye contact with him, he stares at her with an intensity that's unsettling. She smiles and nods. He doesn't respond. Later, as she's leaving, the old man approaches her. He's thin, stooped, probably in his 70s. He looks at her aid organization ID badge, clearly marked with English text and an American flag, and begins to cry. He reaches out and touches the flag on her badge. Then, in heavily accented but unmistakable English, he whispers, "Help me. I'm American." Chen is stunned. She tries to speak with him, but the village elder quickly intervenes. The old man is ushered away. Chen is told he's confused, senile. He's not American. He's been with the village for many years. She should forget about it. But Chen doesn't forget. When she returns to the capital, Vientiane, she reports the incident to the US Embassy. She provides the village name, describes the man, offers to take officials back to meet him. The embassy thanks her for the report. They say they'll look into it. She never hears back. 3 months later, Chen returns to the village. The old man is gone. The villagers claim he died of natural causes. They can't or won't show her where he's buried. When she pushes, she's asked to leave and not come back. Chen files additional reports. She contacts POW/MIA advocacy groups. She speaks to journalists. Her story is credible. She has no reason to fabricate it, and her details are consistent. But without the old man, there's no physical evidence, no way to confirm his identity, no DNA, no photographs. The Pentagon's official response: "We take all reports seriously, but without corroborating evidence, we cannot confirm this individual was an American serviceman." The file is closed. Again. What becomes clear over decades of investigations and research is that this isn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense. There's no smoke-filled room where villains plot to abandon soldiers. It's worse than that. It's a bureaucracy protecting itself. At every level, officials make reasonable-sounding decisions. Intelligence reports aren't pursued because they're unverified. Rescue operations aren't attempted because they're too risky. Diplomatic pressure isn't applied because it would damage relations. Families aren't told the truth because it would give them false hope. Each decision, viewed in isolation, seems defensible. But the cumulative effect is devastating. A system designed to protect the reputation and interests of the government, regardless of what happened to the men who served it. The military classification system makes it worse. Documents are stamped secret, not because they contain sensitive tactical information, but because they're embarrassing. Evidence of mistakes, proof of negligence, admissions of failure. And the classification rules ensure that by the time documents are automatically declassified, usually after 25 or 50 years, the people involved are retired or dead, the families have given up, and the public has moved on. It's a perfect system for burying the truth. What does this silence cost? For the prisoners, if any survived into the 1980s or beyond, it cost them everything. Decades of their lives, their youth, their families, their country. They endured captivity believing rescue would come, that their country would move heaven and earth to bring them home, that they mattered. They were wrong. For the families, it cost them closure. Many died never knowing the truth about their sons, husbands, fathers. They spent decades oscillating between hope and grief, unable to fully mourn because they couldn't be sure. The government's lies turned their suffering into a special kind of torture, the torture of uncertainty. For the American public, it cost them trust. When even a portion of this story comes out, through congressional hearings, declassified documents, whistleblower testimony, it reinforces the cynical belief that the government lies about everything, that institutions can't be trusted, that patriotism is for suckers, and for the military, it costs them credibility. The unwritten covenant between soldiers and their country is simple. You fight for us, and we'll bring you home. Always, no exceptions. When that covenant is broken and then the breaking is covered up, it damages morale and recruitment in ways that last for generations. The irony is that if the government had simply told the truth in 1973, we believe some men are still being held, but we lack the intelligence and political leverage to retrieve them, it would have been devastating, but honest. The country could have dealt with it. Instead, they chose the lie, and then spent 50 years defending it. Today, in 2025, any American POW from World War II, Korea, or Vietnam still alive would be in their 80s or 90s, if they survived at all. The odds are overwhelming that they're all dead now. Time has done what governments wouldn't, ended their captivity permanently. Robert Garwood, the Marine who came home in 1979, is still alive. He's in his 80s now, living quietly in Virginia. He spent the past 4 decades fighting to clear his name. Some POW MIA advocates believe him. Others think he collaborated and lied about other prisoners to deflect from his own actions. The truth, as with so much of this story, remains murky. Bill Hendon, the congressman who fought so hard in the 1980s, published a book in 2007 called An Enormous Crime: The Definitive Account of American POWs Abandoned in Southeast Asia. It's exhaustively researched and deeply damning. It was mostly ignored by mainstream reviewers. Sidney Schanberg, the journalist who investigated the cover-up, died in 2016. His POW-MIA reporting, arguably some of the most important work of his career, is barely mentioned in his obituaries. Anne Griffiths, the Navy wife we met earlier, spent 30 years fighting for information about her husband. She died in 1996 without ever learning his fate. Her children continue her work, now in their 60s themselves. The Pentagon's POW/MIA accounting agency continues to search for and identify remains. They do genuine work, and they've returned thousands of service members to their families. But they operate within a system that has never fully reckoned with the decisions made decades ago. On a wall in the Pentagon, there's a marble plaque listing the core values of the United States military. The first word is honor. The story of abandoned POWs isn't about honor. It's about what happens when national interest collides with moral duty and interest wins. It's about the calculations governments make in darkness, away from public scrutiny, when bringing men home becomes inconvenient. 60 years after the end of the Vietnam War, 70 years after Korea, 80 years after World War II, and the files are still sealed, researchers are still fighting for access, families are still seeking answers. The men in those cages, whether they died in the 1950s, 1980s, or last week, kept faith with their country. They believed in the covenant. They believed someone would come, but no one did. The greatest tragedy isn't that men were captured in war. That's the terrible reality of combat. The tragedy is that after they were captured, they were erased, written off, declared dead while they were still alive, abandoned not by accident, but by policy. And then, for 50 years, the evidence of that abandonment was locked in government files, classified and hidden, so the rest of us would never have to confront what was done in our name. That's the dark history of POWs, hidden in government files. Not just a story of prisoners left behind, but of a system that worked exactly as designed, protecting itself at the expense of the men who served it. Thanks for watching. On a wall in the Pentagon, there's a marble plaque listing the core values of the United States military. The first word is honor. The story of abandoned POWs isn't about honor. It's about what happens when national interest collides with moral duty and interest wins. It's about the calculations governments make in darkness, away from public scrutiny, when bringing men home becomes inconvenient. 60 years after the end of the Vietnam War, 70 years after Korea, 80 years after World War II, and the files are still sealed, researchers are still fighting for access, families are still seeking answers. The men in those cages, whether they died in the 1950s, 1980s, or last week, kept faith with their country. They believed in the covenant. They believed someone would come, but no one did. The greatest tragedy isn't that men were captured in war. That's the terrible reality of combat. The tragedy is that after they were captured, they were erased, written off, declared dead while they were still alive, abandoned not by accident, but by policy. And then, for 50 years, the evidence of that abandonment was locked in government files, classified and hidden, so the rest of us would never have to confront what was done in our name. That's the dark history of POWs, hidden in government files. Not just a story of prisoners left behind, but of a system that worked exactly as designed, protecting itself at the expense of the men who served it. Thanks for watching.